Section 38 being Chapter 10, Parts 5 and 6 of the History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 10, Part 5, The Siege and Capture of Plataea. In the next summer, Archidamus was induced by the Thebans, instead of invading Attica, to march across Kithaeron and lay siege to Plataea. Like Elis itself, the Plataean land was sacred in memory of the great deliverance of Hellas which had been wrought there, and the Spartan king, when he set foot upon it, called the gods to witness that the Plataeans had first done wrong. He proposed to the Plataeans that they should evacuate their territory until the end of the war. They might count their trees and their possessions, and all should then be restored to them intact. Having consulted Athens, which promised to protect them, the Plataeans refused, and Archidamus began the siege. The Athenians, however, were true to the policy of avoiding continental warfare, and notwithstanding their promises, sent no help. Plataea was a very important position for the Peloponnesians to secure. It commanded the road from Megara to Thebes, by which communications between the Peloponnesus and Boeotia could be maintained most easily without entering Attica. The visitor to Plataea must not suppose that the city which Archidamus besieged extended over the entire ground plan which now meets his eye, for he sees the circuit of the city as it existed a century later, occupying the whole surface of the low triangular plateau on which the town stood. The Plataea of Archidamus corresponds probably to the southern and higher part of the space occupied by the later town. The wall of the older Plataea cannot have been much more than a mile long, for the small garrison, 400 Plataeans and 80 Athenians, could never have maintained a longer line of defence in a place where nature had done almost nothing to assist them. Having surrounded the city with a palisade to prevent anyone from getting out, Archidamus employed his army in building a mound against the southern wall. They worked for 70 days and 70 nights. The Plataeans endeavoured to counteract this by raising the height of their own wall opposite the mound by a structure of bricks set in a wooden frame. They protected the workmen by screens of hide against burning arrows. But as the mound rose higher and higher, a new device was tried. They made a hole in the wall underneath and drew out the earth from the mound. The Peloponnesians met this device by putting into the gap clay packed in baskets of reeds. This could not be drawn away quickly like the loose earth. Another plan was then devised by the besieged. They dug a subterranean mine under the wall to some distance beneath the mound, and drew the earth away as they had done before. This effectually retarded the progress of the mound, for though the besiegers were numerous, they had to carry the earth from a considerable distance. The Plataeans resorted to yet another device. From the two extremities of that portion of the wall which they had raised in height, they built an inner wall in crescent shape, projecting inwards, so that if the outer wall were taken, the Peloponnesians would have all their labour over again. They also showed ingenuity in frustrating the battering rams which the besiegers brought against the walls. They placed 2 poles on top of the wall projecting over it. To the ends of these poles they attached a huge beam by means of iron chains. When the engine approached, they let go the beam, which snapped off the head of the battering ram. The besiegers then made an attempt to set the town on fire. They heaped up faggots along the wall close to the mound, and kindled them with brimstone and pitch. If the prevalent south wind had been blowing down the slopes of the mountain, nothing would have saved the Plataeans from the tremendous conflagration which ensued and rendered the wall unapproachable by the besiegers. When this device failed, the Peloponnesians saw that they would have to blockade Plataea. They built a wall of circumvallation about 100 yards from the city, and dug 2 fosses, one inside and one outside this wall. Then Archidamus left part of his army to maintain the blockade during the winter. The blockaders, of whom about half were Boeotians, established a communication by means of fire signals with Thebes. At the end of another year the Plataeans saw that they had no longer any hope of help from Athens, and their food was running short. They determined to make an attempt to escape. The wall of the Peloponnesians looked like a single wall of immense thickness, but it actually consisted of two walls 16 feet apart. The middle space, which served as quarters for the garrison, was roofed over, and guard was kept on the roof. Along the top there were battlements on each side, and at every 10th battlement there was a tower which covered the whole width from wall to wall. There were passages through the middle of the towers, but not at the sides. On wet and stormy nights the guard used to leave the battlements and retire under the shelter of the towers. The escape was attended with much risk, and less than half the garrison attempted it. The plan was carefully calculated. They determined the height of the wall by counting and recounting the number of layers of bricks in a spot which had not been plastered, and then constructed ladders of exactly the right length. On a dark night, amid rain and storm, they stole out, crossed the inner ditch, and reached the wall unnoticed. They were lightly equipped, and while their right feet were bare, the left were shod, to prevent slipping in the mud. 12 men, led by Ammias, ascended first, near 2 adjacent towers. They killed the guard in each tower, and secured the passages, which they held until all their companions had mounted and descended on the other side. One of the Plataeans, in climbing up on the roof, knocked a brick from one of the battlements. Its fall was heard, and the alarm was given. All the besiegers came out on the wall, but in the blackness they could not discover what it was, and no one dared to move from his own place. Moreover, the Plataeans in the city distracted their attention by sallying out on the side opposite to that on which their friends were escaping. The Peloponnesians lit their danger signals to Thebes, but this had also been foreseen by the Plataeans, who by lighting other beacons on their own wall confused the signals of their enemies. But what the Plataeans had most to fear was an attack from a band of 300 men, whose duty it was to patrol outside the wall. While the last of the Plataeans were descending, they arrived with lights. They were thus illuminated themselves, and a good mark for the arrows and darts of the Plataeans who were standing along the edge of the outer ditch. This ditch was crossed with difficulty. It was swollen with rain, and had a coat of ice too thin to bear. But all got over safely except one archer, who was captured on the brink. The escape was perhaps effected on the north side of the city. The fugitives at first took the road to Thebes, to put their pursuers off the scent, but when they had left Plataea about a mile behind them, they struck to the right and reached the road from Thebes to Athens, near Erythrae. 212 men reached Athens. A few more had started, but had turned back before they crossed the wall. This episode is an eminently interesting example of the survival of the fittest, for a melancholy fate awaited those who had not the courage to take their lives in their hands. In the following summer want of food forced them to capitulate at discretion to the Lacedaemonians. 5 men were sent from Sparta to decide their fate, but their fate had already been decided through the influence of Thebes. Each prisoner was merely asked, "Have you, in the present war, done any service to the Lacedaemonians or their allies?" The form of the question implied the sentence, and it was in vain that the Plataeans appealed to the loyalty of their ancestors to the cause of Hellas in the Persian war, or implored the Lacedaemonians to look upon the sepulchres of their own fathers buried in Plataean land, and honoured every year by Plataea with the customary offerings. They were put to death, 200 in number, and 25 Athenians, and the city was razed to the ground. The Peloponnesians now commanded the road from Megara to Thebes. It is hard to avoid reproaching the Athenians for impolicy in not coming to the relief of their old and faithful ally, and maintaining a position so important for the communication between the Peloponnese and Boeotia. Their failure to bring succour at the beginning of the siege may be explained by their sufferings from the plague which still prevailed, and in the following year a more pressing danger diverted their attention, the revolt of a member of their maritime confederacy. Part VI. Revolt of Mytilene. Archidamus had invaded Attica for the third time, and had just quitted it, when the news arrived that Mitylene and the rest of Lesbos, with the exception of Methymna, had revolted. This was a great, and, as it might seem to Athens, an unprovoked blow. It was not due to any special grievance. The oligarchical government of Mitylene confessed that the city was always well treated and honoured by Athens. The revolt is all the more interesting and significant on this account. It was a protest of the Hellenic instinct for absolute autonomy against an empire such as the Athenian. The sovereignty of the Lesbian cities was limited in regard to foreign affairs. Their relations with other members of the confederacy were subject to control on the part of Athens, and their ships were required for Athenian purposes. Such restraints were irksome, and as they had seen the free allies of Athens, most recently Samos, gradually transformed into subjects, they might fear that this would presently be their own case too. The revolt had been meditated for some years. It was hastened in the end, before all the preparations were made, such as the closing of the harbour of Mitylene by a mole and chain, because the design had been betrayed to Athens by enemies in Methymna and Tenedos. The Athenians, on the first news, sent ships under Cleippides to surprise Mitylene at a festival of Apollo, which all the inhabitants used to celebrate outside the walls. But the Mytileneans received secret intelligence and postponed the feast. The Lesbians had a large fleet, and the Athenians were feeling so severely the effects of the plague and of the war that the rebellion had a good prospect of success if it had been energetically supported by the Peloponnesians. Envoys who were sent to gain their help pleaded the cause of Lesbos at the Olympian Games, which were celebrated this year. At the most august of the Panhellenic festivals, by the banks of the Alpheus, it was a fitting occasion to come forward among the assembled Greeks as champions of the principle of self-government, which it is the glory of Greece to have taught mankind. And as Mitylene had no grievance beyond the general injustice of Athens in imposing external limitations on the autonomy of others, her assertion of that principle carried the greater weight. Lesbos was admitted into the Peloponnesian League, but no assistance was sent. The revolt from Athens was accompanied by a constitutional change within the borders of Lesbos itself. Except Methymna in the north, the other cities in the island, Antissa, Eresus, and Pyrrha on her landlocked bay, agreed to merge their own political individualities in the city of Mitylene. By the constitutional process known as Cynicism, Mitylene was now to be to Lesbos what Athens was to Attica. The citizens of Pyrrha, Eresus, and Antissa would henceforward be citizens of Mitylene. Lesbos, with Methymna independent and hostile, would now be what Attica was before the annexation of Eleusis. Meanwhile the Athenians had blockaded the two harbours of Mitylene, and Paces soon arrived with 1,000 hoplites to complete the investment. He built a wall on the land side of the city. At this time the Athenians were in sore want of money, for their funds had been seriously strained, especially by the expenses of the siege of Potidæa. As a measure of economy, the hoplites sent from Athens to reinforce the besiegers were required to take the oars themselves. A small squadron was sent at the same time to the Carian district to levy tribute from states which had defaulted, a dangerous mission which met with no success. The tribute of the empire was increased by a new extraordinary assessment, and at home they resorted to the expedient of raising money by a property tax. This tax, now introduced for the first time, differed both in object and in nature from the property tax of the 6th century. In the first place, it was not imposed permanently, but only to meet a temporary crisis. Secondly, it was to be used for purely military purposes. Thirdly, it was imposed on all property and not merely on land. Economical conditions had changed since the days of Pisistratus, and landed proprietors no longer formed the bulk of the richest men. The tax yielded in the first year 200 talents, and was frequently reimposed. The urgent need justified it, but it increased the bitterness of the oligarchs, and helped to strain the allegiance of the moderates. It was probably first introduced by Cleon, who was this year a member of the council. It became associated with the policy of the demagogues. Towards the end of the winter the Spartans sent a man, his name was Seleuthus, to assure the people of Mitylene that an armament would be despatched to their relief. He managed to elude the Athenians and get into the city. The spirits of the besieged rose, and when summer came 42 ships were sent under the command of Alcidas, and at the same time the Peloponnesians invaded Attica for the fourth time, hoping to distract the attention of the Athenians from Mitylene. The besieged waited and waited, but the ships never came and the food ran short. Seleuthus, in despair, determined to make a sally, and for this purpose armed the mass of the people with shields and spears. But the people, when they got the arms, refused to obey, and demanded that the oligarchs should bring forth the corn, and that all should share it fairly, otherwise they would surrender the city. This drove the government to anticipate the chance of a separate negotiation on the part of the people, and they capitulated at discretion. Their fate was to be decided at Athens, and meanwhile Paces was to put no man to death. The fleet of Alcidas had wasted time about the Peloponnesus, and on reaching the island of Mykonos received the news that Mitylene was taken. He sailed to Erythrae, and there it was proposed to Alcidas that he should attack Mitylene, on the principle that men who have just gained possession of a city are usually off their guard. Another suggestion was that a town on the Asiatic coast should be seized, and a revolt excited against Athens in the Ionian district. But these plans were far too good and daring for a Lacedaemonian admiral to adopt. He sailed southward, was pursued by Paces as far as Patmos, and retired into the Peloponnesian waters, where he was more at home. The ringleaders of the revolt of Mitylene were sent to Athens, and along with them the Spartan Seleuthus, who was immediately put to death. The assembly met to determine the fate of the prisoners, and decided to put to death not only the most guilty who had been sent to Athens, but the whole adult male population, and to enslave the women and children. A trireme was immediately dispatched to Paces with this terrible command. The fact that the Athenian assembly was persuaded to press the cruel rites of war so far as to decree the extinction of a whole population shows how deep was the feeling of wrath that prevailed against Mitylene. Many things contributed to render that feeling particularly bitter. The revolt had come at a moment when Athens was sore bestead, between plague and the war. Every Athenian had a grudge against Mitylene, for his own pocket had suffered through the tax which it had been necessary to impose, and the imperial pride of the people had been wounded by the unheard-of event of a Peloponnesian fleet sailing in the eastern waters, of which Athens regarded herself as the sole mistress. But above all it was the revolt, not of a subject, but of a free ally. Athens could more easily forgive the rebellion of a subject state which tried to throw off her yoke, than repudiation of her leadership by a nominally independent confederate. For the action of Mitylene was in truth an indictment of the whole fabric of the Athenian empire as unjust and undesirable, and the Athenians felt its significance. The mere unreasoning instinct of self-preservation suggested the policy of making a terrible example. It was another question whether this policy was wise. The calm sense of Pericles was no longer there to guide and enlighten the assembly. We now find democratic statesmen of a completely different stamp coming forward to take his place. The assembly is swayed by men of the people, tradesmen like Cleon, the leather merchant, Eucrates, the rope seller, Hyperbolus, the lamp maker. These men had not, like Aristides, Cimon, and Pericles, family connections to start and support them. They had no aristocratic traditions as the background of their democratic policy. They were self-made. They won their influence in the state by sheer force of cleverness, eloquence, industry, and audacity. A man like Cleon, the son of Cleinitas, whom we now meet holding the unofficial position of leader of the assembly, must, to attain that eminence, have regularly attended week after week in the Pnyx. He must have mastered the details of political affairs. He must have had the courage to confront the Olympian authority of Pericles, and the dexterity to make some palpable hits. He must have studied the art of speaking, and been able to hold his audience. Cleon and the other statesmen of this new type are especially interesting as the politicians whom the advanced democracy produced and educated. It would be a grievous error and injustice to suppose that their policy was determined by mere selfish ambition or party malice. Nearly all we know of them is derived from the writings of men who not only condemned their policy, but personally disliked them as low-born upstarts. Yet, though they may have been vulgar and offensive in their manners, there is abundant evidence that they were able, and there is no proof that they were not generally honest, politicians. To those who regretted the dignity of Pericles, the speech of Cleon or Hyperbolus may have seemed violent and coarse, but Cleon himself could hardly have outdone the coarseness and the violence of the personalities which Demosthenes heaped on Aeschines in a subsequent generation. These new politicians were for the most part strong imperialists, and Cleon seems to have taken fully to heart the maxim of Pericles to keep the subject allies well in hand. It was under his influence that the assembly vented its indignation against Mitylene by dooming the whole people to slaughter. But when the meeting had dispersed, a partial reaction set in. Men began, in a cooler moment, to realise the inhumanity of their action and to question its policy. The envoys of Mitylene, who had been permitted to come to Athens to plead her cause, seeing this change of feeling, induced the authorities to summon an extraordinary meeting of the assembly for the following morning to reconsider the decree. Cleon again came forward to support it on the grounds of both legal justice and good policy. Thucydides represents him as openly asserting the principle that a tyrannical city must use tyrannical methods, and rule by fear, chastising her allies without mercy. The chief speaker on the other side was a certain Diodotus, whose name has won immortality by his action at this famous crisis. Diodotus handled the question entirely as a matter of policy. Cleon had deprecated any appeal to the irrelevant considerations of humanity or pity. Diodotus, carefully avoiding such an appeal, deprecates on his own side with great force Cleon's appeal to considerations of justice. The Mytileneans have deserved the sentence of death, certainly, but the argument is entirely irrelevant. The question for Athens to consider is not what Mitylene deserves, but what it is expedient for Athens to inflict. We are not at law with the Mytileneans, and do not want to be told what is just. We are considering a matter of policy, and desire to know how we can turn them to account. He then goes on to argue that as a matter of fact the penalty of death is not a deterrent, and that the result of such a severe punishment will be injurious to Athens. A city which has revolted, knowing that whether she comes to terms soon or late the penalty will be the same, will never surrender. Money will be wasted in a long blockade, and when the place is taken it will be a mere wreck. Moreover, if the people of Mitylene, who were compelled to join with their oligarchical government in rebelling, are destroyed, the popular party will everywhere be alienated from Athens. The reasoning of Diodotus, which was based on sound views of policy, must have confirmed many of the audience who had already been influenced by the emotion of pity. But even still the assembly was nearly equally divided, and the supporters of Diodotus won their motion by a very small majority. The ship which bore the sentence of doom had a start of about a day and a night. Could it be overtaken by the trireme which was now dispatched with the reprieve? The Mytilenean envoys supplied the crew with wine and barley, and offered large rewards if they were in time. The oarsmen continued rowing while they ate the barley, kneaded with wine and oil, and slept and rowed by turns. The first trireme, bound on an unpleasant errand, had sailed slowly. It arrived a little before the other. Paces had the decree in his hand, and was about to execute it, when the second ship sailed into the harbour, and the city was saved. The wrath of Athens against her rebellious ally was sufficiently gratified by the trial and execution of those Mytileneans who had been sent to Athens as especially guilty. Having taken away the Lesbian fleet and razed the wall of Mitylene, the Athenians divided the island, excluding Methymna, into 3,000 lots, of which 300 were consecrated to the gods. The rest they let to Athenian citizens as clerics, and the land was cultivated by the Lesbians, who paid an annual rent. Part 6. This recording is in the public domain.